Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hi, everybody. Tom Woods here, episode 2660 of The Tom Woods Show, with Dan McCarthy, who wears numerous hats, editor of Modern Age, syndicated columnist, vice president for publications at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and beloved Tom Woods Show guest, who was invited to come on here a couple of days ago, and events have transpired in such a way since then that the conversation I imagined us having on this episode has changed at least twice in my mind because of the way things have turned out. So welcome back, Dan. I don't know what to say here.
Thanks, Tom. And I imagine by the time viewers are watching this, events may have changed yet again. So we
keep our fingers crossed. Trump, just hold everything together for 24 hours, please. So, you had just written an article for, what's the publication, Dan? You know the one I'm talking about Trump and the anti-war right.
Maybe a Compact?
Compact, that's right. That's right. So you had just written something about that before the bombs were dropped on the sites in Iran.
That's right.
And you were trying to make the case that, hold your horses, don't go panicking or I don't want to say saying things you might regret, but in other words, don't go to the extreme of saying, well, Trump's just a neocon, so forget it. There's no point in even bothering. That the situation is more complicated than that and less dire. So then you wrote that article, and then we got what happened. And I was wondering, is Dan thinking, well, doggone it, this might undermine my thesis. But then as time went on, and this all happened in the matter of a couple of days, that nobody knew exactly what the scope of this intervention would be. And then, in fact, Trump was kind of joking about the term regime change all of a sudden and making light of it, that why shouldn't we have regime change in Iran? And suddenly it looked like everything's on the table. Maybe Lindsey Graham is going to get everything he ever wanted, or Mark Levin. And then all of a sudden it's, okay, the thing's all over and there's a ceasefire. I'm glad I'm not the guy chronicling this on a day-to-day basis, Dan, but what was going through your mind as the author of an article like that?
Well, I'm against even the intervention that we've already had, which is the bombing of these three nuclear sites in Iran. So it's not that I was writing in defense of any action that Trump was about to take. What I was saying was, try to keep a certain amount of perspective here. So folks were treating this as if it would be a complete betrayal, a shocking thing for Trump to do. In fact, Trump has bombed other countries before. He's launched military strikes against Iran before. He has always campaigned from 2016 to 2020 to 2024, saying that he doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. So a little bit of calm and perspective is required here. The other problem is that, a lot of our friends immediately have this view, and unfortunately, it's kind of a parallel to what you find with the neocons. The neocons will point to any country in the world and they will say, this country is dangerous to us, therefore we must invade it. And our side has the tendency to say, this country is not dangerous to us, but if we invade it or if we drop bombs on it, then it suddenly becomes enormously dangerous to it. And the same kind of a threat inflation that we hear from the other side now applies to us because we're getting into a conflict. And both of those are false perspectives. You've got to evaluate things as they actually are. So people who've been worrying that we are immediately going back to 2003, that we are going to immediately escalate from an air war into a regime change operation with boots on the ground, that might happen. That's certainly a worst case scenario, but don't, sort of give up and throw in the towel before you've actually gotten anywhere close to that. So, as of the night we're recording this, there had been very good signs that we were going to get a ceasefire and that, this will be a war that'll be over for the United States within, about 48 hours. And even for Israel, in the span of about 12 hours. Right as we were about to record, I was looking at Twitter and seeing reports of some rocket fire hitting Israel. So who knows whether that's violating the ceasefire. So again, by the time people are watching this, we may be in a worse situation. But regardless of the case, whether it looks like things are calm or it looks like things are deteriorating, there is a need for a certain amount of distance emotionally and intellectually from what's happening in order to think things through and to say whatever point we may be at, we need to try to work very hard to make sure that we get to peace as quickly as possible, as securely as possible, and don't simply, immediately give in to our worst fears.
I want to follow up on that, but before I forget, there were some reports about J.D. Vance being a voice of, let's say, caution and restraint on this, and even a report that he had become animated and upset with Israel, saying that the U.S. is going to be dragged into this. I don't even know if sometimes these stories are psyops or not. I don't even really know, but there is a part of me that suspects that if it had been Vance in charge, he might have taken a hard line with Iran. But my instincts tell me he wouldn't have done this. What do you think? Do you think that's the case?
I hope that's the case. I don't really have enough, inside knowledge or a fine enough intuition about this that I would say with any confidence either way. The other thing I just don't know is whether, Trump was working with the Israelis from the very beginning, going into a peace process that looked like it was going to have diplomatic negotiations for some sort of new Iran deal negotiated by Trump, or whether, in fact, from the very beginning, this was a attempt to, sort of catch Iran off guard and to give Israel more of an opening to take its actions. It's possible, any number of possibilities, could be the case. And rather than speculate about them, I'm content to take things as, they simply are in terms of the actions that we know have been taken and the situation that we know exists. So I think that, there's, it's clear that Trump has not taken a maximalist view. It's clear that there are people in the Trump administration, including Tulsi Gabbard, who have, made the case that there's no need for us to be getting into any kind of conflict with Iran right now. Tulsi Gabbard, I think, has been somewhat misrepresented by, in some cases, both her enemies, but also her friends too, who have tried to say that, Gabbard had claimed that Iran had no weapons program whatsoever. What she actually said was that the U.S. intelligence shows us that Iran is not currently developing a weapon, which is true, but that's actually different from saying that Iran doesn't have a program which is enriching uranium to weapons grade, which can then be very quickly turned into a nuclear weapon. So I think Tulsi Gabbard has been quite honest here. I think she's been a helpful voice to Trump, telling him, reasons not to do this. I think within the administration, there are others. Some reports say Pete Hegseth is one of them. Some reports say J.D. Vance is another, who have been urging President Trump not to get into a conflict that Israel has been fighting with Iran. But I don't feel as if, we have enough insight into the administration behind closed doors that we can say definitively exactly what the positions either of President Trump himself or of other folks within the administration have been.
Now, I've been following, the response to this on Twitter. And boy, this has not been a fun few days on Twitter, because you've seen, the fracturing of Trump's movement, very, very visibly. But it's been interesting to see the kinds of arguments that the other side, if I may put it that way, has been making. They'll say things like, it's not really a war, you're all exaggerating. But then the second it seems as if Trump might want to escalate it, then suddenly they're ready for that. But of course, you guys say we're in there for regime change. No, it's just going to be in and out. But the second Trump starts talking, hinting that he might be favorable toward regime change, well, then we're hearing all about the Shah's son and how easy that would be. We just install him. So I can't really take these people seriously when they say, you libertarians were all panicked. This was always just going to be a limited thing. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But at any of the decision points where it could have come a bigger thing, you guys were ready to jump on board that.
That's absolutely right. No, and you've seen also that Trump has been getting strange new respect from hardcore neocons like Bill Kristol, from all sorts of voices within the liberal establishment media, David Frum in The Atlantic, all of the usual suspects who have spent 8 years or more trying to destroy Donald Trump. Suddenly, they like the guy because he's blowing up a foreign country, or at least, using a very large, munitions against, purported nuclear facilities within Iran. So it goes to show, all of this is about not just getting us into war, but also the biggest war possible. And that is, the great dream that Lindsey Graham and Bill Kristol and The Atlantic magazine and all these other horrible people have. Luckily, I do feel some degree of confidence in saying that is not Donald Trump's dream. Now, Donald Trump Trump likes to be tough. He likes to negotiate, not just, diplomatically, but also saying, you know what, force is on the table, and I've proven to be willing to use it, and therefore you should listen to me when I say something but needs to be done diplomatically. You know that there is a threat behind that. It's not just, talk. But I don't think Trump has the sort of dreams and hopes for, large-scale military interventions, forever wars, and regime change that you find are absolutely characteristic of all the people on the other side of us in these debates.
Right. So it makes you wonder, how long can this, I don't want to say love affair, but this admiration for Trump really last? You're mentioning the neocons and the never Trumpers, which is a overlapping group. And you mentioned Bill Kristol. Well, Bill Kristol, now this is at least as of the last I checked, Bill Kristol still couldn't bring himself to use his own words to praise Trump. So what he did was he posted an article praising Trump, and then he quoted complimentary things about Trump in quotation marks from the article. So he, at no time, at least from what I saw, or at least if he changed his mind on that, it took him a while, did he say, I, Bill Kristol, have to give Trump some credit. He just could. It's been 10 years, Dan. He couldn't break the 10-year streak. So he quoted other people saying the things. But meanwhile, it served to remind me that Mark Levin had been a never Trumper. I think he was a Ted Cruz supporter. And he was like leading the charge. And anytime it looked as if Trump might waver, Levin was just absolutely hysterical. Like even now, he's saying, I don't like the word ceasefire. The guy cannot take yes for an answer.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely shameless. They will, attack Trump for years at a time. They will, then turn around on a dime and basically say that as long as he's giving them the war they want, then he is, first of all, acceptable. And in some cases, maybe they're going to say, hey, he could yet evolve into George W. Bush, and therefore we would be totally thrilled with him. So it is the mirror, sort of opposite of, our own friends who are saying, the more that Trump becomes like George W. Bush, the more opposed they are. Well, there are people who insanely enough see that as being a good thing and see the Bushification of Trump as being something to be desired and hoped for. I'm not surprised by it. I mean, you may recall on an earlier episode of the podcast, you mentioned Mark Levin, and my immediate reaction was to burst out laughing because I can't take this guy seriously. I think he is a thorough, sort of right down to the very bone marrow, a thorough neocon, low IQ shill who has, Bill Kristol, at least I can somewhat respect him on certain levels intellectually. He's read some serious books. And even the fact that he, won't praise Trump in his own words, he'll use someone else. At least he's being a little bit consistent there. But Mark Levin, I just don't know why. I don't know why there are people who listen to him, although I know that there are such people, and that's, kind of a sad commentary on our country.
If you're worried about the value of your hard-earned savings getting eaten away by inflation, trade wars, or reckless Fed policy, it's time to secure and grow your wealth in something they can't inflate away, and that's gold. But a lot of gold owners just buy gold and then let it sit there collecting dust, and then feel like they're missing out on the growth happening in other asset classes. Well, that's why I lease my gold with Monetary Metals. I earn a 4% annual yield paid in gold every single month while still owning my ounces. Again, the yield you earn is paid in ounces of physical gold, which you get in addition to any price appreciation from gold during the year, which, as you know, continues to break all-time highs in 2025. Join me and thousands of happy clients who are earning a gold income every single month. This is a no-brainer for those looking to earn an honest return in honest money. The Fed can print dollars, they can't print gold. Now's the time for you to start growing your wealth in ounces. Go to monetary-metals.com/woods to learn more. That's monetary-metals.com/woods.
Yeah. Well, he brought, apparently onto his program, he brought John Yoo on, who is that's a name that might ring a bell with people who have been around a while, that 20 years ago, John Yoo was weaving various rationales for a very expansive interpretation of Article 2, the presidential powers, including presidential war powers. And my gosh, I'm back, it must have been 15 years ago, but Levin and I got into this big back and forth over presidential war powers, because at that time he was busy defending Barack Obama for wanting to take military action unilaterally in Libya. And as a neocon, he favors extending that courtesy to presidents of either party. And I just, there's just no, I know nobody cares about the Constitution anymore. I hate to sound cynical like that, but really that is, if they did, we'd live in a very different country. But I just feel like, as a matter of fact, I can't just sit there as he claims that this is all perfectly normal and acceptable and it's been done a million times. I know all the arguments and he's wrong about them. But then I think about, here's how I was thinking about the parallel with George W. Bush, though, because under George W. Bush, I think there were about a half dozen Republicans who opposed the war in Iraq in the U.S. House. And obviously Ron Paul was one of them. Jimmy Duncan was another. There's a handful of them. And, and of course, everybody knew Dr. Paul was going to be against that. That was obvious. Anybody who'd followed his career. And they knew the way he voted, and they knew that he just voted on principle. But George W. Bush, as terrible of a human being as he was, never singled Ron Paul out and condemned him for not being a team player, and he's a bum and a loser, and we should get rid of him. And now, I know that Newt Gingrich tried to, when Dr. Paul was trying to get back in Congress, they ran an ex-Democrat against him unsuccessfully, but they just let him be. They just let him be. They let that handful of Republicans be. They they didn't get prominent appointments or anything, but they let them be. But to observe, of all you look at the corrupt Republican Party, and to think that the one member of it you're angriest at is Thomas Massie that's a very sad spectacle.
Yeah, I agree. And I will say that one of the reasons I'm not as optimistic as some of our friends are about congressional war powers votes and other things is that Congress is usually even worse than the president when it comes to many of these questions. I would dread the idea of having an AUMF right now because if I'm not mistaken, the 2001 AUMF, which launched the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror, I think that's still in effect right now. More than 20 years later. Or if it's not, then it's been a very recent, development that it's not. So, Congress is, I have, a certain degree of confidence in President Trump. He's not a non-interventionist. He never has been. He's, obviously not following, Ron Paul's version of the Constitution. There's a lot of things you can say about Donald Trump where if you have too high of an estimation of what Trump's meant to stand for, you're always going to be disillusioned and surprised and, angry and, despairing. But you really shouldn't have any of that because if you've been watching Trump for the last 10 years, you kind of know both what his virtues are and also what his vices are. But when I look at the Republican Congress, I see so little virtue and so much vice. That's where I think, maybe things have not changed a whit over the last, 10 plus years or 20 plus years. And it seems like, today, by the way, it's not just Thomas Massie who deserves credit, but Marjorie Taylor Greene, who, of course, is always demonized by, the usual suspects in Washington, D.C. She's been very outspoken and critical of the idea of going to war with Iran. And, I've always had, a favorable view of her, and this is, strengthening that because, whatever her limitations, she's clearly, she understands something fundamental that, Speaker Johnson and all the other establishment Republicans in the House do not.
Yeah. She's had some excellent, lengthy statements that she's posted on Twitter that I've reproduced verbatim in my own email newsletter. And of course I have areas. I feel stupid even having to point this out. Of course I have areas of disagreement with her. What does that matter? I have areas of disagreement with you. Like, what does that matter? She had some important insights, and man, did they jump at her. Mark Levin attacked her for that, and a series of others, calling her all kinds of names. And because one of the things she had said, what she was trying to say was that concern for, for countries halfway around the world that are really obviously not a threat to us, and that the involvement is obviously being pushed by foreign interests, let's say, is not in our interest, and that here we have a society that has a ton of problems, and Iran is just not one of them. Unless you are just a propagandized Fox News viewer, which I would hope people who listen to me, are at are a little higher level than that. Understand, you're not being cheeky just because you listen to Fox News. Like there's the requirements for cheekiness are a little bit higher than that. So if that's where you are, then yeah, you're not going to understand what she's saying. But she's trying to say, enough is enough. Why don't we take, when we look at the alacrity with which everyone jumps up to resolve this matter, what if we applied that to all the things we were actually put in office to address? And the response from Levin was to say, because one thing she said was, look, I know people who have been killed by, Mexican cartels or illegal immigrants or whatever, but I don't know people who have been killed by Iran. And that was the unforgivable line. There were 117 lines in that piece, but the one unforgivable line was she didn't know anybody had been killed by Iran. And they're saying, what about all our noble servicemen who have been killed by Iran? Now, Dan, I don't know the circumstances of all those, but something tells me that if the U.S. didn't have an imperial foreign policy, every one of those men would be sleeping in his bed alive today. And it never occurs to anybody to ask that question. Why do we have, what was that man doing in a military base halfway around the world in the first place? Other countries aren't like this. Why are we like this? So good for Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, she has courage, and she understands intuitively something that I think, Trump supporters in general need to figure out, which is the anti-war. It's not that, Trump got elected simply because he was critical of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. It helped him, certainly, but it's that there's a connection between being critical of these wars and the very idea of populism, right? So if you are a defender of the establishment, you're going to be in favor of all of these wars, precisely because they are about taking attention away from America's own problems and focusing instead on faraway parts of the world where you as an American politician get to feel important because you're redrawing the borders of other people's countries and you are changing the regimes, and otherwise you're just playing God in foreign countries. And it really annoys a lot of these people that they can't do the same thing right here at home, and that Americans, will tell them, hey, I don't like your big, Washington, D.C. scheme to change the way my small town works, or to change the way, the composition of my hometown, or to say that our border doesn't matter. I think there really is a profound connection between this obsession that our DC elites have with trying to manipulate everything in every other part of the world and their total neglect of Americans here at home. And Americans at home feel that. And the thing is, if the so-called MAGA movement, which is becoming, now it has branches of political power, it has the president, it has, a lot of leeches like Mark Levin who want to, latch onto this, seemingly healthy body and sort of gorge themselves on its health. You've got this, but, MAGA, the label doesn't mean anything. One of the dumbest things I saw was, someone on Twitter saying, oh, Thomas Massie isn't MAGA. Look, if MAGA comes to mean neocon, who the hell would want that label attached to them? It's the fundamental commitment to the American people that matters the most. It's populism, not the MAGA label. And if, MAGA and, the movement supporting Donald Trump, if it becomes more interested in foreign wars than in what's right for America and defending the American people against the forces that are harming them, then basically you're going to see this power of populism is going to be co-opted by the left instead. And we saw that already in 2006. We saw it in 2008. The reason we got Barack Obama was because Obama was actually, he was not, by any means a real anti-establishment guy, but he was slightly more anti-establishment than another Bush or a John McCain or Hillary Clinton. And that helped him a hell of a lot. And that's what gave him a movement, basically, and put him in power. And then the fact that Democrats don't have a successor to Barack Obama is precisely because he was fake. He was not a real populist. But I think the populist right, such as it is, should really take heed here and take a warning that they will fail. They will become the establishment, very, very quickly. And you will get a populist left that will eat their lunch or drink their milkshake, or maybe, it'll be Morlocks that consume them like Eloy in H.G. Wells's Time Machine. But you'll really get a revolution from the left if the anti-war right, if the populist right doesn't stay true to staying out of foreign conflicts and prioritizing the needs of Americans.
Friends, at this point, no doubt you're having difficulty counting how many ways one podcaster can improve your life. Well, here's another one. I want to tell you about my friends at Federated Computer. They're going to save you a bundle. They're changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our businesses, but the best business software does not have to cost thousands of dollars each month. As a matter of fact, the typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more on their software bill and gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business and without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what is wild, the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. And you can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business, rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud, and now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of the Tom Woods Show, and they're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code WOODS. So go to www.federated.computer to begin to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. These folks are going to do you a big, big favor. Check them out.
And look, the fact is, we all know, everyone has to admit, if we had 250 Massies in the U.S. Congress, you would have a country that looks a lot more like the one these people claim to want. Like, you know that. Whereas if you had 250 Mike Johnsons, we would have the country we have now. I mean, I don't see how that's even debatable. And yet, I guess one consolation has been that there is at least a decent sliver out there of people who aren't going along with the 2 minutes hate. It's a lot longer than 2 minutes against Thomas Massie, who, by the way, has taken this in stride. I mean, this guy's been through it and back. I mean, within the past couple of years, everything in the world has happened to him. His wife died totally unexpectedly in her 50s. You know, I'm sure he expected they would grow old together and, you know, like everybody wants to. And he lost her. And then all of a sudden, he's like public enemy number one. He gets no credit from the left, of course. They don't say, oh, you must be a good guy. No, that's not how the left works. So he's hated by them. He's hated by a lot of his own people who don't even know enough about him. They just know they've been told to dislike him to even really make a judgment. And yet he carries on in good humor. He posted just the other day, Trump had this really long Truth Social post. I mean, it was just a wall of text. And Massie reproduced it on Twitter and said, geez, I mean, Trump went so to war with me today on Truth Social that it should require a congressional declaration. You know, so he doesn't hit back or whatever. He takes it in stride. It just does it perfectly. Now, I jumped into that thread and said, because he said that Trump's attack on me should require a congressional declaration. I said, yeah, unfortunately, the neocons will come along and say you don't need a declaration. You know, we all know how that turns out. But I hope that he just, you know, Trump just moves on and moves on from this. But I don't know. Are they actually setting up a PAC to raise money to drive Thomas Massie out? Can that really be real?
Well, I don't know. I mean, they can certainly try, and they tried with, again, that, you know, half dozen or so list of Republicans who were against the Iraq war back in 2003. So Jimmy Duncan had a number of challengers over the years. Walter Jones, you know, had got primaried a few times, and they both survived all of those attacks. So, by the way, Walter Jones, I mean, this is one of the things that, you know, it's tragic, but it also is a test of character that kind of shows you who the real heroes are. But the fact that Massie has, you know, such a good grace, you know, under fire, the fact that, you know, Jimmy Duncan similarly was able to withstand, you know, just these waves and waves of attacks on him by the neocons. And, you know, I mean, it's one thing, when you're Thomas Massie or when you're Ron Paul, you've got an ironclad set of convictions. You know, everyone knows you as Mr. Libertarian, or, you know, sort of, they know where you're coming from, and they kind of expect that. But a lot of, you know, I mean, Jimmy Duncan was a regular Republican from Tennessee. He was a conservative, certainly, but nobody thought of him as, you know, a kind of celebrity, you know, philosophical leader of a wing of the party. And yet, you know, he faced everything. And then, of course, Walter Jones from North Carolina. Jones was actually someone who voted for the Iraq War in 2003. He was a big gung-ho supporter of it. He, he introduced this resolution to rename the French fries in the congressional cafeteria Freedom Fries. That was how stupid all this neocon stuff was then, and just like it is now. But Walter Jones, was a real, human being, a real adult, a genuine, man and statesman who, looked at the consequences for his own district of, sons and, daughters coming home in body bags and saying, why did I support this war? What was I doing? This was stupid of me. And so Walter Jones becomes one of the strongest critics of the Iraq War very quickly. And boy, the neocons go after him time and again. They primary him several times. And he just doesn't relent. And he too is a figure who, he withstands the slings and arrows and becomes, not just a good congressman, but someone who really stands out as one of the very few people I would look at as kind of a hero in American politics in the last, 20, 30 plus years.
It should also be noted that he represented a heavily military district. So it was even more difficult for him to take the position he did, but he did it. And he wanted to make up for his earlier support for the war, and everywhere he went for the rest of his life, he was speaking out against it and speaking out against the whole war machine that makes these interventions seem appealing to the public.
He was haunted by it, and if you think about the contrast between someone like Walter Jones on the one hand and your typical Republican in Congress, whether it's Speaker Johnson or any of the others, just to see, one of them as a man who understands real tragedy and who's, lived to regret his actions and is trying to make amends for them, which is, the most Christian thing you could possibly do. And then you look at these just ciphers who are in Congress and who, are making life or death decisions for other people, for their own countrymen, and yet who are just, less than half an inch, deep in terms of their ability to reflect on their own ideas and their own, commitments and mistakes. Wow, it's just, it goes to show you just what a, you could have the world's dumbest AI just replace a lot of these Republicans in Congress, and you would actually have an upgrade in terms of introspection and soulfulness. Whereas, and then you get, just one person as rare as hen's teeth, like Walter Jones or Jimmy Duncan or Ron Paul or Thomas Massie, who's actually capable of reflecting on things like a real human being. And it's a night and day difference.
I was thinking about yet another tweet. I don't want to mention the person's name because the names don't matter. It's the ideas. But I had somebody in my feed saying, I am racking my brain to try to figure out how and why it is that a big chunk of the right has become anti-war peaceniks. And I thought, well, that's a book right there. That would be a really great book for somebody to write that. And I almost feel like I've written enough about it over the years here and there that I could probably put that thing together. I'm not going to because I'm too lazy now at this stage of my life. That's up to some young whippersnapper to make his name doing something like that. But I had an article in the American Conservative a long time ago, I think when you were editing it, and it was about Robert Nisbet and his views of the warfare state and his view of how revolutionary war is for a society. And hard leftists recognize that, and even the American progressive left recognize that. If you read the New Republic, which was which began publication when World War I was getting started with the European powers without the U.S. in it, they were already talking about all the possibilities for domestic reconstruction and remaking society in their image, because Americans would get used to the experience of the war, and the war would require them to move away from their commitment to private property and free market economy. They would get accustomed to more bureaucratic management, the management of society by experts. They looked forward to that with great hope for the future, for the progressive vision. So there are many things you could say about why it is that somebody on the right would be against war. It's interesting that the mainstream left, now there's some people on the hard left who might actually be somewhat reliable on issues like this, but if you look at the key conflicts in American history, like a lot of progressives supported the Spanish-American War because the Spanish were backward as compared to the U.S. Overwhelmingly, the progressives favored World War I. Overwhelmingly. I mean, you can count on one hand. We know Randolph Bourne said war is the health of the state. Yeah, we can count Randolph Bourne and a handful of other people, but the rest of them were all in favor of it. And you go down and the Cold War, again, you had some hard leftists who would be against, but by and large, you had this mainstream consensus in favor of that. So it's because of Vietnam that we have this impression that liberals don't like war. Mainstream liberals do not have a problem with war, as they've made clear repeatedly time and again. It was mainstream liberals who went into Vietnam to start with. It was a mainstream left that pushed it hard under Lyndon Johnson. So right away, we're operating under a false understanding to begin with that the right is for, being serious and tough and letting those countries know who's boss and all that. I remember Jonah Goldberg saying that, every 20 years or so, we need to pick up some crappy country and throw it against a wall to show we mean business. And you can't imagine Russell Kirk talking that way.
No, and in fact, Russell Kirk writes The Conservative Mind, which is his book in 1953, which kind of helps to popularize the very word and the genealogy of conservatism. He writes that book inspired in part by his experience during World War II. So he serves, as do most American men of military age. He serves in the military during World War II. And first of all, his own experiences, among all these conscripted soldiers. He's working in a chemical weapons testing ground in Utah, of all places. And he says, first of all, the experience of actually being in the military, you're just surrounded by, these conscripts who are basically, they don't want to be there. These are like criminals just plucked off the street. And now we put them in a uniform and we're calling them soldiers. It's ridiculous. So Kirk is horrified by that. He sees the bureaucracy of the military and sees, what a mess it is. And then, of course, he sees the moral horror of the atomic bombing, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it was interesting to see the responses a few weeks ago to Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, mentioning, the horror of the atomic bombings and seeing all of these, very ill-informed, sort of childish little, Paul Gottfried used to have this phrase, mini-cons. They're like neocons, only they're so immature, they don't even qualify as being neocons. They're just mini-cons. They're just little these miniature,
right, like
characters.
Irving Kristol was a smart guy you could respect on some level.
Yeah. Well, these munchkins, these munchkin conservatives who say, how can you possibly have Tulsi Gabbard criticizing Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Russell Kirk hated the atomic bombings. Richard Weaver, who writes Ideas Have Consequences. That book was written in large part because Weaver was horrified and disgusted by the fact that even the supposed good guys in World War II are resorting to the mass, incineration of civilians using new weapons like the atomic bomb. Robert Nisbet, as you've already mentioned, was very critical of the modern warfare and the military-industrial complex. Evelyn Waugh, the great British Catholic novelist. I recommend to anyone, listening to this or watching this podcast, read his books that are known as the Sword of Honor trilogy. It's a set of 3 books. And they're based upon his own experience in World War II. And again, it's absolutely damning. He basically says, that the protagonist of these books, he enters the war thinking that this is a war to, save Western civilization from barbarity. And, this is all going to be a noble endeavor. And then at the end of the war, he realizes this was a war that basically handed, Stalin almost everything Stalin wanted, including what he wanted when he was a Hitler's ally, right? And that this war, in fact, was kind of the death of Western civilization, not the salvation of it. And it's not because Waugh or Russell Kirk or Robert Nisbet or Richard Weaver, none of them was a pacifist, none of them was a leftist, none of them had a romantic idea that there are no intractable conflicts between human beings or that there are no rivalries and hostilities between states. None of them had that kind of rose-tinted view. They were not disciples of Rousseau. They did not believe in, this sort of kumbaya leftist vision. On the contrary, they thought that war was something that, was not going to be always avoidable, but they thought it was a terrible thing even if you can't avoid it. And they thought that it was, in fact, something that destroyed, the very best, much of the very best of what our civilization stood for, and tended to introduce and encourage revolutionary elements. And the other side to this, there's a great historian I've spoken to named Sean McMeekin. I don't know if you've interviewed him before, but he's certainly someone I think you should have on your podcast. McMeekin is a great historian of communism. And one of the things he points out is that, Lenin had a strategy, and it was probably, you can look at all these idiots, these neocons who have their regime change strategies that, never work or that always backfire. Lenin had a regime change strategy for his own civilization, his own, Russian country, his homeland, that actually worked. And that regime change strategy was called revolutionary defeatism. And the way it worked is you actually encourage your country to go to war as much as possible, and you expect the wars to turn out very badly. And that's great because that creates actually the conditions that lead to left-wing Bolshevik revolution. So when I look at the neocons, I think of them as being, they have this weird history where their intellectual forefathers were kind of, within the Trotskyist camp. So they actually do have an authentic Leninist genealogy. But I think the neocons of today are just morons who don't realize that what they're doing actually amounts to what the communists would call revolutionary defeatism. They want America to get into an endless series of wars that go on forever and that sap, our sense of connection between the people and their leaders, and that create a sense of ferment and, disillusionment within our country that leads to a revolutionary condition. And you look at the Vietnam War, basically that's what the Vietnam War winds up doing, that we get into this war and it winds up, empowering the most radical elements of American society, creating, a series of cultural revolutions that we are still living in the consequences of, more than 60 years later, 50 years later. These wars, this is the result they have. And you can look at, the Iraq War, same way. Like over and over again, these wars have a demoralizing effect on the country and they promote the power of the radical left.
I mentioned this a bunch of times, but one of the times that I had Pat Buchanan on the show, and boy, we sure could use Pat these days, Dan. But one of the times I had him on, I know he wrote speeches for Nixon about the Vietnam War. Being on the Tom Woods show is not going to change his mind about that. But I did say that, that even from a let's say right-wing point of view, you could say that the war inadvertently gave tremendous strength to the counterculture and to cultural trends that all conservatives would deplore, and that after all the enormous expenditure and the inflation that occurred as a result, that people suffered from, it was very hard on families. After all this damage done to American society, the communists won anyway. And it wasn't the end of the world. I mean, Vietnam's a trading partner. I mean, it wasn't the end of the world. They were the Vietnamese communist regime is unspeakably loathsome. But this is one of these things where America first. I'm sorry that this is happening in Vietnam, but for heaven's sake, most people can't get their own households in order, much less try to resolve matters going on in Vietnam. That's for the Vietnamese to resolve. And I think I came close to getting to him to at least concede that it was possible at least to make that argument. That's something.
And there were a number of, sort of realpolitik thinkers, people like Hans Morgenthau, for example, who looked at the Vietnam War and they said, not only is this not a war that America needs to be involved in, but really, the fundamental issues here are not going to lead to a domino effect. It's not going to lead to communism taking over, progressively larger swaths of Asia. And if you look at what's happened now, I mean, the Vietnamese Communist Party is a horrible party. The country is run by a terrible government. But the Vietnamese are actually contrary to the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party, simply because there are these national differences. And they've fought wars with one another, in fact, both proxy wars and direct border wars. There really are, John Lucas, who's a great historian who died, about 10 years ago. Lucas is an interesting character. He is, quite an old-fashioned conservative. Towards the end of his life, he became so sort of horrified by populism that he started drifting farther and farther left, I'm afraid. But in general, Lukács was a very, wise historian. And he recognized that nationalism, not communism, was really the dominant power in 20th century history. And I think that continues to be the case in the 21st century. And so even if you had two communist governments, if they had nationalist differences with one another, as the Vietnamese and the Chinese do, those nationalist differences are actually going to be the thing that matters. And now, if you look at the Middle East, there are sectarian differences, there are regime differences, there are ethnic differences. I mean, that is a whole mess that, America cannot manage. Israel simply has to try to exist and survive in this very complicated situation that, that they are placed in the middle of. That's, obviously going to be an ongoing challenge for them, but it's not something that we can resolve or that our heavy hand is going to, simplify, because in fact, all we can do is make things a lot messier and more complicated. And really, I mean, one of the advantages that Israel has over Iran right now, the Iranian, revolution of 1979 is almost 50 years old. The problem with having a theocracy for about 50 years is that it very quickly turns out to be the case that it doesn't succeed in bringing heaven down to earth. So even the truest of true believers can look at, a corrupt and venal government in Iran and say, what was the point of having a revolution? What's the point of all these things we do? It's not that we believe, any less fanatically in the religion, but clearly, this government is not bringing, about, some sort of, reign of perfect Islam within the world, even within Iran, let alone exporting it elsewhere. So revolutionary regimes, they wind up, sort of discrediting themselves even by their own survival. And this happens to the Soviet Union as well, simply because, their whole point as revolutionary regimes is meant to be that they're new, they're transformative, they're trying to appeal to the romanticism of changing the world right now. And it turns out half a century later, they haven't done that. They've just calcified and become as bureaucratic as, the most Byzantine of states. So Israel has an advantage that, Iran is this very calcified state right now. But if you have regime change in Iran, that's actually what could unleash something new, a new form of Islamism, a new sort of post-Islamist, it could be nationalism, it could be a kind of military government, a kind of fascism, any number of permutations. It could be a lot more energetic and a lot more dangerous, actually, than this, sort of gerontocratic theocracy that you have in Iran right now. All of those things are possibilities if you have regime change, which is why I think the Israelis are actually, when they talk about regime change, they may talk about executing or assassinating certain leaders of the regime and just having them replaced by others, but they're not actually talking about changing the nature of the regime as a whole, because they know there are many more ways that you could get something that's actually more dangerous than simply leaving these, sort of calcified, post-revolutionary institutions in place.
It boils down to I think, a sense that an authentic conservative understands that societies are not like tinker toys. They can't just be taken apart and put back together by engineers. That there are consequences when you try to do things like that, and that the results are very rarely, the results of social engineering schemes are very rarely very neat and very rarely what their architects expect. I want to make sure I remember to ask you. You released at least the first of the new podcasts that you're publishing over at ISI, and I would like you to take a minute, if you wouldn't mind, tell us what it's called so people can find it, and what you're talking about over there.
Yeah, so I have a new solo podcast at YouTube and other fine outlets. It's called Modern Age with Dan McCarthy. There have been 2 episodes recorded so far, and by the time people see this, there may be a 3rd episode out as well. My first episode looks at the nature of elitism and the question of whether conservatives can actually be populists when obviously, many of them come from elite educational backgrounds. Many of them come from families of wealth. You might think that elitism is sort of the natural milieu of conservatism. And I try to, explain that there are 3 kinds of elitism and different kinds of populism as well, and the interaction that these things have with one another. And I use the life and example of William F. Buckley Jr., who, of course, is a Yale guy and a bonesman, a skull and bones guy, and in many ways is very much an elite American, but who also said at one point that he would rather be ruled by the first, 1,000 names in the phone book than by the faculty of Harvard University. So my first episode of the podcast looks at that question of elitism, populism, and conservatism. And then my second podcast, Modern Age with Dan McCarthy, talks about regime change and why all the wars we've been fighting that are about ideas and that are about regimes wind up leaving the American people feeling disappointed and alienated from the leadership class in this country. Because traditionally, the kinds of wars that are actually popular are the ones that give the people something. And that means taking territory, for example. I'm, someone who would probably have opposed the Mexican-American War at the time, but you can see why the Mexican-American War winds up being rather popular for the grassroots in the country, because they actually get some territory that they can settle afterwards. You look at all these other wars that are, mostly ideological, whether it's Vietnam or the Iraq War, or now, the wars we might be fighting with Iran and others. And what do the American people actually have to show for it at the end of the day? What do they actually get out of it? How are the American people or their territory enlarged and magnified and augmented by the experience? And if your answer to that is just ideological, if it's just abstract, then you're actually indicating that you are alienated from the American people And if you are their leader, if you are an elected official or a journalist claiming to speak for the American people, you are probably way out, on a limb and more distant from them than you realize, which again is what creates the opportunity for new populists to come along and say, hey, this war might be declared a success. Maybe it's the first Persian Gulf War, for example, but actually, what did you as an American get out of it that makes you better off than you were before the war? And of course, the Persian Gulf War in 91 looked like a big success for George H.W. Bush. His approval ratings skyrocketed up to 90%, and yet he loses an election the very next year. He loses an election, when you see 2 or 3 different varieties of populist insurgents. You see Pat Buchanan challenging George H.W. Bush in the 1992 Republican primaries. You see Ross Perot arising as a populist third-party candidate in 1992. And you also see Bill Clinton trying to, create a new kind of populism in the Democratic Party as well. And all 3 of those wind up being, forces that, first of all, prove a great challenge to George H.W. Bush and then actually defeat him, precisely because his attempt to run on his success as a war leader from the year before is a total failure because Americans didn't get anything out of the 1991 Gulf War.
And yet, at its height, his approval rating was 91%. I remember that distinctly. 91%, almost unheard of in American history. 91%. So
it goes to show, yeah.
Unstoppable, you would think.
Well, it goes to show, people put a lot of weight into polls, but I think, you have to imagine what is the underlying voter psychology? What is it that actually matters to voters, not just, in an instant when you poll them, but, over the course of a couple of years and over the course, of their development as a voting public. And, yes, people like successful wars. They like very short wars. We see that basically all of our wars throughout history, this even applies to World War II, they're popular for a short time near the beginning, but then they become less popular as they drag on. So you can look at the polls and be, impressed by these numbers that go up to 90% or whatever, 91% in George H.W. Bush's case. And yet they're not telling you the fundamental reality of American politics, which is if the American people don't feel like they are better off after some sort of great action like that, then chances are you're actually going to wind up weak and losing the next election rather than strong and winning it.
Okay, so Modern Age with Dan McCarthy. Guys, go check that out. Look for that. Read Dan's syndicated column. You find it in the New York Post. That's how I read Dan, is checking out the New York Post. And he is educating one confused New Yorker at a time, but not just New Yorkers. New York Post gets all over the place, and I always appreciate the Dan McCarthy column. Thanks a million, Dan. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Tom.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.